Is 13 minutes past 8.
We have stopped the transfer of detainees to certain installations as a precautionary measure. We are awaiting and we are aware that a UN report will come out, and we will look into that report.
And that report has just come out. It's State of It with Selwyn Manning from scoop.co.nz. Good morning to you, Selwyn.
Good morning, Glenn. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Yes, so that report has come out, and the government is now having to respond.
Yes, it is. Now that United Nations, it released that report yesterday. It's a concerning report, clearly. It found that Afghani suspects in the war on terror have been subjected to shocking and systematic torture, Glenn. Many Western nations, as we know, that have taken part in NATO-led operations in this war on terror are politically and potentially complicit in handing over Afghani detainees, knowing that they may have been tortured. Now, this whole thing, Glenn, it comes back to issues that we've kind of watched, and particularly journalists like John Stevenson, New Zealand investigative journalism, who just won a major award yesterday issued by France for excellence in war correspondence. Now, he had noted on different times in social democratic states like Norway have grappled with this fact of this problem where their own people had been handing over people suspected of terrorism charges to the United States and to Afghani security forces, knowing that they may have been tortured. Other countries, including New Zealand, have deployed armed forces to this war. Their soldiers, they were used to round up terrorist suspects and others. They were ordered to hand them over to US and Afghan forces, and then ordered to look the other way when those people were stripped of their human rights and led toward their own torture and, in some cases, death. Now, potentially, the military superiors and leaders of these nations, and this includes New Zealand here, have been involved in what could be determined war crimes, breaches of international law and conventions. And that's the gravity of this situation here. And back in September, the International Security Assistance Force, or what is commonly known as the ISAF, was tipped off that the United Nations was preparing to release a report that found there was systematic terror occurring up there in Afghanistan. And that's what the intro is about. And here is an extended clip toward that produced by Al Jazeera, Glenn.
The torture allegations are said to involve 9 detention centres run either by the Afghan police or by the intelligence agency, the NDS. Electric shocks, the threat of sexual assault and the beating of prisoners' feet are reported. Some of the facilities were nicknamed nail-collecting factories for the way inmates had their fingernails ripped out under interrogation.
And you mentioned John Stevenson and the fact that he just won that journalism award. Now, that article came out back in April, didn't it?
Yes, it did. It was right on the eve of Anzac Day. Metro magazine published John Stevenson's investigative report, and it was titled Eyes Wide Shut. Now, this report was the result of Stevenson's investigation into official government and defence documentation into what our soldiers had been ordered to do up in Afghanistan, and also what the government and the New Zealand Defence had publicly stated our soldiers had been doing up in Afghanistan. And he looked also, obviously, into the reality of what our SAS had been doing and ordered to have done. As the SAS themselves told John Stevenson during his many numerous trips to the combat zones inside Afghanistan, that there were issues where they were cringing themselves, that they were having to hand over people that they had rounded up over to the United States and Afghani forces, knowing that it was most likely that they would be tortured. So you can see from that article that there were very, very concerning and damning claims and accusations that were coming through here that would go all the way through our government apparatus, from, defence right to the Defence Minister and the Prime Minister themselves, and knowing that this may have been going on. Now, this resulted report, it was published in Metro, Clearly it was compelling. And this is how 3 News announced it on the eve of that report being, and this is significant later on in this bulletin, on the eve of that bulletin being produced. Glenn, this is the 3 News bulletin here.
Kia ora, good evening. A magazine investigation to be published tomorrow claims New Zealand's SAS troops in Afghanistan have taken prisoners and may have handed them over to Afghan authorities known for torture. If the torture allegations are true, it means our soldiers have breached the Geneva Conventions, which set standards for the treatment of prisoners.
So a pretty major headline at the time.
Absolutely, and back then again, 3 News' Mike McRoberts, very credible reporter, remember, he reported it this way, Glenn.
The Prime Minister could not have been more emphatic in his denial last year that our SAS troops, seen here in the aftermath of a firefight in Kabul, have taken any prisoners during their deployment in Afghanistan. But a Metro magazine investigation by journalist John Stevenson has uncovered evidence that the unit has not only taken prisoners, but transferred them to Afghan authorities known for torture and mistreatment.
So what can we make of that?
Well, basically the issue came down to this. The public was asked by the Prime Minister and his politicians to trust them and not to trust the journalist. And for days this issue, it limped on. Eventually opposition politicians, they called for an inquiry. But instead, the Prime Minister and his Defence Minister, they refused to have an inquiry. They went all out to try and ruin the reputation of the journalist that actually got this information out there. John Stevenson, and he was under attack. And there's a clip here to remind us of that, Glenn.
Jerry Matapara was chief of the Defence Force at the time these incidents are alleged to have happened, and questions are now being raised about his suitability to become Governor-General.
There have been some very serious allegations made about the New Zealand Defence Force, which ultimately lands at his feet.
But Prime Minister John Key says it's Stevenson's credibility that's in question.
John Stevenson's the guy that texted me one night impersonating Duncan Garner. This guy is not a credible source, okay?
But that, Stevenson says, is just more spin. Rebecca Ryan.
Which is something that John Key has done to other journalists as well, hasn't he?
Yes, he has. Investigative author Nicky Hager, he put out his compelling book, Other People's Wars. That was exactly the same tactic that the Prime Minister John Key used then to discredit the actual person who was writing these reports that was putting the government in a bad light. Now, since then, the former head of New Zealand's Defence Force, you heard the name mentioned in that previous clip there, Lieutenant General Jerry Matapara, the man who many critics believe to be responsible in some way for this controversy in New Zealand's context here, a potential breach, I must remind you, of international law. Now, since then, when this issue broke back in April and May, he's been given a knighthood, he's been given an honorary doctorate by Massey University and appointed as New Zealand's Governor-General here. Now, Matapara was sworn in since then, since he was sworn in as Governor-General, this controversy in some ways died down a bit, and that was until late September. Remember, when only weeks ago, when the New Zealanders, we all heard of the news of the death of SAS soldier Leon Smith, then it was you know, back on the agenda. What we saw there was Defence Minister Wayne Mapp admitting, for example, that the SAS were in a combat role. The Prime Minister was at odds with his Minister of Defence and his defence heads and saying, no, they're just there in a mentoring role. There's no combat. We would probably remember those issues being played out on our TV screens. Yeah. But perhaps an indicator of what was and is the actual truth here is the comparison between what the government was saying back then when it felt it could control the spin, control the information, control its lines, and a comparison to now where this issue is bigger than New Zealand, it's bigger than these guys in the beehive. It's an international issue here, and now they're starting to actually front up to the realities of perhaps what they always knew. And here is a clip in comparison, just to remind us of what they were saying back in April and what they're saying now. Here's Defence Minister back in April, Glenn.
But despite the latest evidence, Defence Minister Wayne Mapp says New Zealand is not directly involved in the arrest and transfer of prisoners.
Well, I've asked the then General Matapara to look into that specifically because this issue came up last year. He has done that on more than one occasion, and he assured me at that time that was not the case.
So what's he saying now?
So the comparison now, here's Matt talking to 3 News' reporter Patrick Gower, filed last night.
Well, the information I have is that they haven't. That's about as far as I can actually, that's the way I can put it. We are talking about Afghanistan here.
That's in Afghanistan, where the United Nations has found there is systematic torture. One of the UN's main offenders is a prison called Department 90/124 in Kabul, where there's beatings, suspects hung by their hands, twisting and wrenching of genitals, and electric shocks.
You're effectively confident enough to tell the people of New Zealand that prisoners caught with our assistance by the Crisis Response Unit have not ended up in the Department 90.
That's the information I have.
So you are prepared to give New Zealanders that undertaking?
No, that's the information that I have.
So this is really, really serious.
It's absolutely grave stuff. And, you know, the United Nations report that we're hearing about there, it went into detail of exactly what's going on. And that included, for example, things like what we heard there, but even more, electric shocks, twisting and wrenching of the detainees' genitals, stress positions, including forced standing, removal of toenails, and threatened sexual abuse were among other forms of torture that the detainees reported. Now, MAP, if we look at this, it's an issue of political credibility here too. MAP, he will bow out of politics once the new parliament is elected in this November, next month. His credibility is a factor in this, but so is the credibility of the Prime Minister. That's an issue too. And it's kind of an issue of certain public interest aspects to this as well. Now, how is the national-led government going to play this issue out? This is getting down to it here. Is it going to continue to spin the positive line that the Prime Minister has kind of anchored himself on? Is it going to continue to attack the credibility of all of those who release sections of truth and reality underlying this situation? A vital public interest aspect of this is the media analysis, and therefore, you know, it's relevant to examining the broader issues of John Key's political style as he brings that to his prime ministership. And Key's strengths, they are there, you know, they are there. He's popular. He is able to connect with Kiwis. These are his strengths here, irrespective of their social standing. He's able to engage with anyone from the Queen's grandson to an average man and woman working in the street. Key's also seen as a positive kind of guy. But is John Key the kind of guy who will not tell people what he decides they do not want to know? Is he the kind of politician who will avoid being the communicator of bad news here? The kind of Prime Minister, perhaps, who will stick to his positive spin, even when the evidence suggests it is simply not true. The state of it is this, Glenn. There are currently 3 unrelated issues here in the New Zealand political arena at the moment that are testing the credibility of the Prime Minister's word, his presentation of truths, even while addressing Parliament. If John Key is fully deserving of the people's trust and that of the title of Prime Minister, he needs to be more than a fair weather friend here. He must be credible, and above all else, he must be honourable. And that's it for this week, I think, Glenn.
State of it. You can find this as a video once more up at scoop.co.nz, and we'll see you again next Selwyn. Thanks very much.